Story we have today. One that at first I was going to ignore because it kind of sounds like a clickbaity headline. DOJ designates New York City as anarchist jurisdiction. This didn't jump out to me as any kind of official legal term or anything will. And I was like, oh, this is just something that Donald Trump had Bob Barr do to score a couple political points against his political, rival now, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. And then I heard Cuomo respond to this, and he was like irate and very, very mad about it. And so I thought, maybe there is something to look into here. And it does seem that this is more than just some, meaningless label that's being applied to New York City. So, Will, can you give us a few details on what an anarchist jurisdiction is and what that means?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, unfortunately, like if only we really did have anarchist jurisdictions here. This term they're using, this is something Trump had like floated before. He'd used this term previously as well, anarchist jurisdictions. But on Monday, the DOJ has actually gone through and slapped this label on New York City, on Portland, and Seattle. And they're basically accusing these cities of basically allowing like lawlessness and violence in the form of the protests and the rioting and stuff. And they're saying that city authorities basically prevented police from doing their jobs to restore order. And so in response to that, the DOJ and the feds are now saying that New York City, Portland, and Seattle will no longer qualify for certain types of federal funding and grants and stuff until they stop being so-called anarchist jurisdictions and allow police, I guess, to enforce certain laws. They are defining this kind of broadly, though. Like, in addition to the cities that don't crack down on the protests and rioting enough to like satisfy the DOJ, the feds can also now slap this label on cities that like have cut police funding recently, or even refused a deployment of federal agents to like manage the protests. And then there's also too, if you read like the DOJ's actual release, there's this catch-all provision they put in there that just says like, quote, any other related factors the attorney general deems appropriate. So you could kind of drive like a truck through this definition here. It's a very broad thing, but so far they've only slapped these three cities with it: New York City, Portland, and Seattle. Um, with New York City, they're mainly pointing to there's been a major police budget cut recently, where the city council agreed to slash I think like $1 billion from the NYPD's usual massive $6 billion budget. And there's also in New York, I think there's the DOJ is saying that New York didn't enforce or didn't crack down on the looting and rioting and stuff that we've seen over the last couple months. And for New York City in particular, this is going to be like a pretty big deal because these federal grants make up a fairly large portion of the city's budget. I think it's like $7 billion of their revenue they get through these federal grants and federal funds. So that could be a pretty big deal for them. But then in terms of Portland, obviously they're pointing to like the more than 100 days of protests that have gone on in that city, which have pretty often escalated into rioting and violence and clashes with the cops. That's also the city where they deployed federal agents over the summer. So that's kind of a no-brainer for why they choose that city to, call an anarchist jurisdiction. And then Seattle, they're referring to the autonomous protester zone thing that the city allowed the activists to set up over the summer, which they kept for like a month. In that case, with they called it Chaz at first, and they later called it CHOP for the Capitol Hill occupied protest, referring to a neighborhood in Seattle of Capitol Hill, not like DC, of course. But the mayor of Seattle really kind of embarrassed herself with that whole protester zone thing. She like fully allowed that to happen. She even sent city workers in there to go build concrete barricades for the CHOP zone. There's photos on Reuters you can see of these guys in yellow vests, like, constructing these concrete barricades. And then she also said it was going to be a summer of love and all this stuff. But you ended up having like 5 different shootings in that protest zone in the space of like a month, where I think 2 teenagers were actually killed too. One a 19-year-old, one 16-year-old. So that's why they're hitting Seattle with this, is over that whole autonomous zone thing, which actually Bill Barr, the attorney general, he recently said that Jenny Durkin, the mayor of Seattle, could face criminal charges for allowing that to happen. So like that's kind of a big deal. But apparently that's also why they've hit Seattle with this anarchist jurisdiction thing. So that's basically the deal, is that the DOJ has slapped this new designation to these 3 cities, and they may pull federal funding from them.
Yeah, so I have a couple just follow. I don't think you have answers for these. As far as I could tell, there wasn't like a official definition. It's not like crime increases by 30% over a 6-month period, then you're an anarchist jurisdiction. Crime goes down by 10% over a 3-month period. That means you get off the list. It doesn't seem like there's any kind of official designation labels, stats, metrics being used here, and so it's seems pretty inherently political to me. Is was that the same impression you got, Will?
Well, I think the DOJ did lay down some like very vague and broad guidelines, but like I'm saying too, the very last guideline is or any other factors the attorney general decides that but no, like you're saying, there's no like quantitative metrics or anything in terms of how crime. It's really all kind of qualitative. Like, are the governments doing enough to take on the protests? So yeah, ultimately, like this is a very political designation. They could pretty much slap on any Democrat city that they want.
And as you mentioned there, that while the police budget, I think you said is like $6 billion a year, and they're looking at cutting it. Overall, the city could lose like $7 billion in federal grants, and so
Yeah,
these aren't just, I guess, law enforcement grants, which is what I thought when I initially read this. But it has to be grants outside of law enforcement. I guess it could be all criminal justice or something. But that's a substantial amount of money, $7 billion in a city that anybody who watches at least any non CNN news will know that that city is really struggling financially right now. Their tax base is gone. Cuomo's begging the rich people to come back, and they don't seem to want to do it. So, taking $7 billion, there's going to be a lot of corrupt city officials who are really mad about their tape being cut down. I would assume.
yeah, no kidding. A little bit less graft, I guess, going on there.
Right. A couple other things. I do know that one of the parents of the dead teenagers is suing the Portland or Seattle mayor for not, enforcing the chop and allowing that to happen. And so,
That's right. Yeah.
there is this really interesting concept that I do think is worth talking about a little bit here, and that is, the police and the governments really have, as ANCAPs will say, a monopoly on violence, but they also have a monopoly on justice, and this includes who actually gets the right, real kind of justice. And so, looking at all these store owners who had their stores broken into, but then the police didn't defend their stores. Really, nobody bothers to like do anything to prevent the looting, and yet you have like 400 police officers around the courthouse or something like that, or they're just set up in random places around town. And so I think that is a real problem, and so this is like an attempt to address that in some way, which seems to be like not all a bad thing. That like, hey, if you're saying that, especially in these cities like New York City where it's hard to get a gun and actually provide defense for yourself, I mean, hell, I think it's like if you want to go defend your store with a bat, that seems more dangerous than not defending it at all. You know what I mean? Then like people are just gonna mob you and come at you. At
Right.
least if you have a gun, that's usually a serious enough deterrent to back a lot of people off, like from just being mobbed and stuff like that. But if you can't get yourself a firearm in New York City, there's absolutely nothing you could do to defend yourself right now. We all remember these transcripts from 911 calls that we got over the summer from New York City where residents were calling, and the dispatchers were basically telling them good luck with that. And
Yeah.
I understand from the dispatcher's point of view, what are you gonna do? But you have to in some way be able to provide some security for people if you're the government and don't allow them to provide security for themselves. And my guess is that this is going to be somewhat of a popular move by the Trump administration. As much as I don't like, arbitrary federal, dictates coming to cities about, how aggressively their police have to act. At the same time, you can't just let people's whole lives be taken away by roaming mobs of looters and rioters, and that's what's happened in a lot of cities, and that that's also a problem. And so don't send the police to every corner in the inner city to police drug laws, but please stop people from burning down businesses, and they won't do that. So it'll be interesting to see, I guess, if this does provoke some kind of action. But my guess will be this will be turned into like a political football, and if anything, these cities will do a little bit less just because it will, be anti-Trump.
Right. Right. Yeah, what you're talking about here kind of reminds me of this concept they call anarcho-tyranny, where it's like the state has the monopoly on violence and, like you're saying, the monopoly on justice, but then they don't use it. They like, they create, they crowd out all the other security agencies, and then they allow the criminals and stuff to run rampant, which is kind of what's, definitely in the case of that chop zone. Like you also had lawsuits from the local businesses suing the city, saying that like you let these people just like run amok and destroy my livelihood. Like how, like I don't know, that's not okay, I think. But then the other thing in terms of like the federal funding, like I'm also not cool with seeing the feds like say, telling localities that, hey, your police have to crack down. But I also am not like, I don't care if the feds pull the funding from these cities. I don't think these cities are entitled to federal dollars. So I would rather those tax dollars be returned to their rightful owners in the private economy. But nonetheless, I'm not like going to cry too hard if they're pulling federal funding from these cities. Like, big deal.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is that the consequence of this isn't anything that we could necessarily be opposed to as libertarians. I guess
Yeah.
the last thing I just wanted to point out is that by the police not doing what they're apparently supposed to be there to do, it does put citizens in more kind of conflict with each other, and you end up with situations like Kyle Rittenhouse,
Yeah.
where it now seems more clear that mobs of people, including a crazed guy named Rosenbaum, just like rushed the kid, and was and then he fired and people died, and it's a real tragedy. I'm not trying to
Yeah.
say that it's not, but just the point that had police officers defending the businesses in Kenosha, Kyle wouldn't have been out there. That seems fairly clear that, he didn't go up there like as a member of a militia, that some business person, I guess, had asked him to like come over and help to watch the business or something like that. And, assuming that the cops would have stood out there, I'm guessing that no business owner says, "Boy, I'd rather have a 17-year-old with an AR standing out front than a police officer." Like, let's be real. Like, even with the state of American police officers today and how abusive and terrible these people are, a lot of times, I think we would all probably take an adult who has some known training over a 17-year-old with a rifle, where there's maybe him on personal level, so you have an idea of how he can handle the gun, but as a 17-year-old, I just thinking myself as 17, there's no way I'd take myself to stand out there. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I don't know anything else. Well,
No, I think we hit on all the points on the anarchist jurisdictions. It's too bad they're not actually anarchist jurisdictions, as I think we would actually kind of want to see, stateless, functioning societies.
right. I think the first step you have to look at is, getting rid of the nonviolent laws, the gun laws, the drug laws, the, other kind of sin laws like prostitution and stuff like that. And
Absolutely.
and then I think the transition to a anarchist jurisdiction where people have their own kind of security force things is far closer. Although I do know that, like, if you're not an ANCAP and you hear that, that might sound kind of overwhelming to one anarchist jurisdiction in a time where a lack of police presence is causing problems. The problem is that the police are also going to enforce gun laws and stuff like that during this time, and so they don't give you a chance to protect yourself, and there's nobody to protect you. So it's the worst kind of chaos anarchy, not the un hierarchy of power that me and Will oppose.